Some of you know that the intaglio prints are produced with a lot of pressure in an intaglio press. No one's really come up with a figure as to how many pounds per square inch it is, but it's a lot. And you can see that effect on most intaglio prints by what's called the plate marks on the back sides. It shows through as an embossing. And on the front side, you can see a tapered edge all around the plate. That's called the bevel. Sometimes called the plate mark too, but it's beveled. And here's the plate for that print. And I brought it because it has a very wide, very big bevel. Bevels come in all sizes, and I'm going to show you the ideal size to use in this studio. What happens if you don't bevel the plate is when the plate goes through the press under all that pressure, it has a kind of pinching action, and it cuts through the blankets. And I have a blanket here to show you. These blankets are wool blankets that we use with the intaglio press. And you can see the cuts that have been made by putting objects through that have sharp edges on them. This isn't these aren't cuts made by straight edges. They're little, who knows what. People without instruction frequently put through all kinds of objects, coins and bottle caps, and we've seen almost everything in this studio. But that's one of the main reasons, is not to cut the blankets. Another reason is not to cut the paper itself. So you have to know about beveling. There are essentially two kinds of bevel in my view. One's called a service bevel, and it's you think of it as a rough bevel. So you don't spend a lot of care on it, because picture yourself starting on your plates, and your intent is to pull some proofs as soon as possible, see how you're doing. And it often occurs that in some shops you'll start out on a plate and not give it too much thought, and you get excited and you pull a proof and you forget to bevel it. So in our studios, we require everybody bevel their plate as soon as they've cut it. And there's a certain size bevel that I require. I'm going to produce one on this plate as part of this demonstration, so you have an idea of the size. The second bevel is a finished bevel. And there are several arguments regarding the bevel, the aesthetics of beveling, if there is such a thing as aesthetics of beveling. Let's see, I guess I'm going to use these carriage clamps a little more appropriately scaled. The aesthetics of beveling hold that it's the transition from your printed image to the borders of the paper. Since there is a tradition in intaglio prints of having borders of paper, the bevel produces or provides the transition between the printed world and the real world, so to speak. Now, what should the nature of the transition be? That's up to the individual. Some people think it should be very invisible and smooth and slick, and they produce a very highly finished, tapered bevel. Other people, in their haste and in their for whatever motives, produce a bevel that's very rough. It's a kind of transition edge. So there's no one rule, aside from the fact that it has to be serviceable, and that's where the service bevel comes in. A number of ways to produce that. One is with a file. This is, if you go to a hardware store to buy your own, you'll be asking for a bastard mill-cut file. Mill-cut refers to the fact that these cutting edges, striations, are running only in one direction. Now, there's another file, and I don't know the name of it. Maybe it might be cross-cut. I don't know, where there are lines running in the other direction as well. But we use a mill cut because we want a shearing action, and we want it to leave a fairly smooth bevel. So when we have a choice, we use a mill cut file. If you don't have a choice, of course, any file will work. If the file is badly plugged up with metal, you have to use a file card to clear it out. Those stiff little wires are capable, it sometimes takes a few minutes, but they're capable of clearing metal that's stuck in those lines. Now, to prevent that from happening again, we've discovered that you can, if you fill the file with chalk, go over it with chalk a little bit, that will minimize the amount of zinc, in this instance, that gets plugged up into the file. Now, I'm having a little hard time here because the plate I chose to use as an example is on the narrow side, and getting the right angle is going to be a bit tricky, but I think I've got it set up. The next thing to remember is always file from below in an upward direction. I'll illustrate that. Well, I think I will. The reason for filing from below in an upward direction is to prevent scratching. If you're going this way, there's a chance that you might slip and hit the plate. If your stroke goes too far, you're up on the plate, and before you can stop yourself, you've made a nice deep scratch. Most light cosmetic, superficial scratches don't matter, but that kind of scratch does. And you're just increasing the chances of that accident happening if you file from above. So you should always file from below. This plate is a little too narrow for me to clamp down this way. It's best to clamp the plate down because it holds it steady. But sometimes plates just don't permit it, and I think this is one of those instances. So I'm going to have to use my bare hands. No one has ever measured that angle. You read in the books that it's 60 degrees or 45. I don't know. I'm not going to try to measure it. I usually go on how wide it is. I've produced a bevel here that would measure about 1/8 of an inch wide. In fact, I have a ruler right here, and I'll show you. Well, it's not quite 1/8. It's just a little less than 1/8 wide. What's important to understand is that the cutting occurs when there's a very steep edge, like on a new plate and you have a 90-degree angle. That's a pretty sharp edge. And if you beveled it steeply, like that, you really haven't done much to flatten that edge out. So the idea is to get it down flat. But if you get it too flat, then there's another edge, second edge that's possible that might cut plates, or cut blankets and paper. So while there's no known angle as to what that might be, you have to kind of use your logic. And if it measured about 1/8 of an inch wide, it's probably adequate, even if the angle isn't exactly right. Yep. Another method is the scraper. I have to clamp it down in this instance. I think what I'll use is a little protective paper here so that I don't scratch my surface. Because to use a scraper as a device requires that the plate be clamped down. You might be able to do it with your bare hands, again, if you're accomplished at that. I have some friends who always bevel their plates with a scraper. That's this little tool. And I don't do it. I always use a file. But if you're practiced at using a scraper, I suppose it should work very well. But since I'm not practiced at that, I just want to demonstrate it. And when you're starting out, I would advise you to plan on clamping your plate down. Don't screw the clamps down so tight that they distort your plate. You have to be careful. It's fairly soft metal. Somebody has started beveling this plate already, so I have a little bit of advantage. It takes a while. If it starts shrieking, I'm going to let this start shrieking at you and then tell you what to do if it starts shrieking. You'll know what I'm talking about. Well, it's not cooperating. If it starts to shriek and vibrate, then you should change the angle of the way you're holding your scraper, because it's should never be scraping at a 90-degree angle to the direction of your scrape. My trouble with this technique is the first edge. I can never start right here, you see. So I always have to end up going in the other direction here, and it never works out very well. So if you discover a way to solve that problem, let me know. You should always check your plate with someone, an advanced student or myself, if you have a question about whether your bevel is sufficient or not. That's what I call a service bevel. It's kind of rough, and it'll print. It'll pick up a little ink. But later on, when you're sure you have it the way you want. Another reason I call it service bevel is that in etching, many times the acid will get at your bevel and eat holes in it or make it jagged. And it's awful time-consuming process to have to stop and paint the bevel and protect it with stop-outs and things. And so I would just say, oh, I'm not worried about that. I'll try to protect it, but if it gets bitten away, I don't care, because I'm going to go back and finish it. When you get to the point where it's the way you like it, then you go back and you do some more of this filing or scraping, and you make what's called a finished bevel. That's where you're exercising that decision about how you want that bevel to look. You want it to be clean and free of, just invisible, then you polish it. And this is where a little kerosene and a burnisher is brought into use. You have to be careful, too, that you don't get up too close and you can cut yourself awfully easily. Many times during the printing process, the last thing you do before you go to the press is clean the bevel. And if you've polished it this way, it'll be a lot easier to clean. It'll clean very, very fast. So I'll show you how a bevel should look. The reason I like to use wood, by the way, is the wood prevents you from punching a hole or, distorting this soft zinc plate. That's how a bevel should look. There are occasions when the holes that you've made will require little beveling. If you're trying to avoid gaposis, you don't want to have white lines around things, you won't have any problem, as I said, if the gap is less than 1/8 of an inch wide. But if you have holes this size, which are probably 1/2 inch, some of them even larger, then it is a requirement that you bevel those edges. Sometimes it's sufficient just to go in and soften. It's just remember that the larger the hole becomes, the more like an edge it is. So you have to have a larger bevel every time the holes, these kinds of shapes become very large. So I guess there's a direct proportion where you have to make a bigger bevel for bigger holes. But again, if it's a situation where the parts are fitting next to each other and you have virtually no gap at all, then you don't need a bevel. I've made a kind of chart to sort of explain what I mean by a file that's held too flat and a file that's held too steep. when you hold the file too flat, it leaves a cutting edge, you can see there. And on where the file is held too straight up and down, you get still another kind of cutting edge. You haven't really achieved anything if you still have that fairly sharp edge. But with the file held just right, then you'll create a kind of bevel that looks this way. And maybe this is 25 or 30 degrees. I don't know how it measures. You can take it a little further and round off these edges till you get what's called a knife edge. And that's like a disappearing bevel. It hardly shows at all as a plate mark. It's kind of dangerous, though, because you can cut yourself on it. Okay, well, this is going to be used as a video cutaway.